Yeah, actually, as I indicated last week, I want to continue with something about a statement. Last week we were focusing on the unique attributes of what does it mean to talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, and I had mentioned the very powerful thought of the Baal HaTanya that the word Mitzrayim has a double meaning. It means Egypt, of course, but Mitzrayim comes also from the same word as Meitzar, limitation, constriction, boundary, blockage. David HaMelech says in Tehillim, Min HaMeitzar Karatika, I call out to God from the narrow, confining place. So the Baal HaTanya explains every person has their own inner Mitzrayim. Could be my egotism, my anger, my selfishness, my lack of compassion, my lack of self-esteem and self-worth. And this inner Mitzrayim paralyzes me, and it blocks me, and it stops me from going forward, and it enslaves me. It enslaves me much more than an enslavement outside of myself, because this is a condition of slavery within the human personality. And the Baal HaTanya says, when God liberated the Jews from Mitzrayim, he put in a spiritual power that enables each and every one of us to become liberated from our own inner Mitzrayim. And that is the meaning of the statement that is otherwise a little enigmatic. Each person must regard themselves as if they were liberated from Mitzrayim. Now, I was never in Mitzrayim, and I certainly was not a slave in Mitzrayim. So is the Torah obligating me to make believe that something happened to me which did not happen to me? Am I supposed to imagine a lie? Is it like a method acting type of thing? Put yourself in the moment. But the Baal HaTanya understands it in a much more metaphorical way. Each person must identify his Mitzrayim and then tap into the cosmic power of Yetziat Mitzrayim to achieve a liberation. Which means when you go through the Seder, or you go through the Haggadah, or even if you go through the Chumash for these weeks, there are two readings, there are two things that you're reading in the words. One is the story that happened to the Jewish people. We were slaves and God liberated us. And that shows God's kindness and God's fulfillment of the covenant to the forefathers. And that is the Jewish national story. That is the story of our history. That is how we became a nation. And every year, parents lovingly tell that story over to their children. And they transmit it as part of a heritage. And all of that is true. But that is the level of narrative that applies to everybody. Every Jew reads that, and that is the story. But in addition to that general narrative, there's an idiosyncratic, private, between the lines narrative in which I focus on my inner Mitzrayim, my inner enslavement, and what are the steps I could take to achieve liberation. You know, it's interesting. I think I mentioned this last week, forgive me for repeating, that, sometimes modern scholars who don't believe in the divinity of the Bible or the historical accuracy of the Bible make the claim, actually it's a very frequent claim, that there's no historical evidence for the Exodus, but the Exodus should be understood as a metaphor for the striving of human liberation. And they even look at the patriarchs and the matriarchs, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Lachav, and Leah, as architects. If you're familiar, archetypes rather. If you're familiar with Carl Jung, right, this notion of the archetype, myth, and people posit a certain dichotomy: is the Torah history, or is the Torah archetype? Is the Torah factual, or is the Torah mythical? In reality, that is a false dichotomy. As a believer in the divine origin of the Torah, we are certainly committed to the proposition that the Torah is historical. Putting aside the 6 days of creation, which has a different dynamic, but certainly the stories of Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yosef, Moshe, the plagues, we believe in the historical accuracy of it. But Instead of posing the dichotomy, history versus metaphor, the better way, the more accurate way of describing it is, history is metaphor. Meaning, the historical events of the Torah are not just isolated historical events. They represent spiritual potentialities that God puts into the universe. Yes, there was an Avram, there was a Yitzchak, there was a Yaakov, a Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, but they are also archetypes, which represent spiritual ideas that come into the world. And thus the Baal HaTanya is perfectly willing to say that there was a historical exodus, and at the same time it is a metaphor and a mashal for the koach of a human being, of a Jew in particular, to be liberated from everything that enslaves us. You know, for many years, I'm not sure if it's still the case, for many years the largest Seder in the world was in Kathmandu, in Nepal, where Chabad had a Seder. Still is, yeah. I mean, a lot of them are Israelis that are doing their post-army wanderlust, their travels, or whatever it would be. So they have, 2,000 people, or whatever it is. So because most of the people that are there are not religious or do not have a fully Orthodox background, so they have to improvise a little bit with rituals that are kind of New Age type rituals. So one of the rituals they do, which may strike you as New Age, and religious people don't do that, is actually a quite beautiful ritual that fits Kabbalistically what Yetziat Mitzrayim is about. When they burn the chametz, Erev Pesach in the morning, so, you make a bonfire, you throw in the bread. So everybody is asked to take a piece of paper, write 3 bad characteristics that they would like to change about themselves. And they burn it along with the chametz, understanding that getting rid of chametz is not only about bread. It's also about getting rid of the arrogance and the conceit and the selfishness and the egotism in the human personality. Now, if that sounds too New Agey for you, let me point out that there actually is a Kabbalistic prayer that many people recite when they burn the chametz that says, just as I am burning the physical chametz, may I burn the chametz of my heart. That represents the arrogance and the conceit. So this New Age ritual of burning a piece of paper along with the chametz is actually echoed in tefillot that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. And in fact, even the Gemara itself refers to the Yetzer Hara as Sa'or Shebe'isa. That means the leavening agent in the dough. That is what the Yetzer Hara itself is described about. In fact, they tell a cute story about a Hasidic Rebbe that he spent hours and hours and hours cleaning the house for chametz with his Hasidim. And at the end of several hours, the Hasidim felt a great sense of accomplishment. We really cleaned this house. But the Rebbe was not happy. The Rebbe said, he pointed to himself, he opened his shirt and he said, and what about the chametz in here? Did we do bedikas chametz in here? So they gave the Rebbe a beautiful answer. The Mishnah says, Rebbe, any place where you don't bring in chametz doesn't have to be checked. It says, your heart is a heart where they don't bring in the chametz. So that was the answer that they gave the Rebbe, that he shouldn't worry about the chametz that's left over there. So, this is an interesting point, because on one hand, when people are impatient with halachic observance, they like to turn everything into metaphors and not do anything, meaning, I don't have to get rid of the bread, I'll just, work on my negative personality traits, which, by the way, is harder than getting rid of the bread. But in truth, as I indicate, this is not an either-or. There is the mitzvah, and then there's the inner meaning of the mitzvah. There's the historical fact, and then there's the spiritual force that it represents. All of those levels are true, and all of those levels are interacting at the same time. The Maharal makes a beautiful point, and this is a little connected to B'Shvat. The Torah has a major concern that Pesach fall after the spring equinox, or during the spring. And there's an immediate problem, because it's called Chodesh Aviv, the month of spring. Now, there's an immediate problem. The Jewish calendar is, of course, a lunar calendar. And a lunar year, meaning 12 lunar rotations, is only on the average 354 days rather. It's an average, days. I'm just giving an average, as opposed to an average solar year of the Earth revolving around the sun is 365. Again, approximations are enough for our example. So that would mean that a lunar year will progressively end 11 years earlier than the solar year.
11 days.
I'm sorry, 11 days. 11 days. So you automatically have a problem. If year one, let's say, Pesach is April 15, then the next year it'll be April 4, and then the next year it'll be in March, and earlier in March, and then in February. So what's going to happen is, in a pure lunar calendar, Pesach will eventually be in the winter. And indeed, Ramadan, the Islamic calendar, which is purely lunar, Ramadan can be summer, winter, fall, spring. It simply follows a lunar calendar. But since the Torah says Pesach has to be in the spring, we need to adjust our lunar calendar with a solar adjustment. And in 7 out of 19 years, including this year, when Pesach is getting a little too early, we add a month of Adar Sheni, or Adar Rishon's Machlokes, which is the added month, to push Pesach later. Right? That's what happens. So it's on the average every 3 years, 7 out of 19 years. So the Jewish calendar is not a pure lunar calendar. It is a lunar calendar with a solar adjustment or a solar intercalation, as it is called, in order to ensure that Pesach is in the spring. Now, the Maharal asks a very simple question. What difference does it make what season Pesach is? You know, when people say, oh, Rosh Hashanah is early this year. Well, not really. Rosh Hashanah is always the first of Tishrei. You know, if Rosh Hashanah would be falling out in Elul, you know, that would be early this year. A Jewish holiday, definitionally, cannot intrinsically be early or late. It always falls out on the same date. So if you have a Jewish calendar, who cares that the Jewish people happen to have left Egypt in spring that first year? We are commemorating a date. The date is the 15th of Nisan. So why go to all this trouble to coordinate the lunar calendar and the solar calendar by a solar intercalation? Why is it important? So the Maharal offers a very, very beautiful point. The Maharal says that because Chazal teach us that God looked at the Torah and created the world, the Torah is the blueprint of the world. That means every physical phenomenon is really representative of a spiritual force that is existing into the world. Physicality and materialism is nothing more than kind of the realization or the concretization of a spiritual idea. So here, the concept is this. Spring is spring because it is the time that the power of freedom and liberation come into the world. Because what is spring? The ground was dormant during the winter. It was apparently non-productive, at least to the naked eye. And in the spring, the fertility of the earth is released. It is freed. But says the Maharal, that's responding to the vibes of spiritual liberation that are in the air. So Pesach has to be during the spring, because if a holiday is not just a commemoration, see, if it would just be a commemoration, just tie it to the date. But it's not a commemoration. It's a re-experiencing of a spiritual power. And what is hinting to you when that power exists is the natural condition of the world. And therefore, Pesach has to be in the spring, because that is the time when God is telling you that the time of freedom and liberation comes into the world. Right? This notion. Now, you may ask the question, well, gee, in the southern hemisphere, that's not the case. Right? Pesach is not during the spring in the southern hemisphere, but that's not a problem, because spiritual vibes enter the world via Yerushalayim, and then they spread. So when it's spring here, the world is in a state of freedom, even if it's not yet spring in Australia or South Africa or whatever it would be. This actually means, again, I'm not going to talk about Tu B'Shvat, although I should have thought about this, but this actually means that a Jew's relationship to nature should be a very strong and powerful one. A sensitive neshama sees in the changes of day to night, in the changes of the seasons, in the positioning and the movement of the stars and the planets, which most people, and I include myself, are woefully ignorant. They see the handiwork of God, and they try to discern the powerful forces that Hashem is releasing into the world, the forces of renewal, rejuvenation, the forces of even dormancy and rest, to regroup your strength for the coming struggles. Nature is a reflection of all that we go through in our own lives. In our own lives, we are part of that pattern of nature. That is why we daven, ideally, optimally. Tefillah is connected to transition points. The best time to daven Shachris is right when the sun is going up. That's Vasikin. So you join in the cosmic song of the universe, greeting a new day. The best time to daven Mincha is right when the sun is sinking. Before Shkia, but as the sun is sinking. Ma'arvit, you daven when it's dark, to understand the patterns of light and darkness as also being metaphors for success and struggle, that in life there are times of blessing and appreciation, and there are times of challenge and adversity. And as I ride through the mornings and the evenings of the day, I understand how to navigate the mornings and the evenings of life. So a Jew should be one with nature. In fact, there was a great Rabbi Avigdor Miller, who died a few years ago, and he taught over many, many years. He really gave Torah teachings for close to 70 years. And one of the themes he emphasized again and again and again is a very basic theme that is found in the Chovas Halabavos, much way before Rabbi Miller. And that is learning to love God by appreciating the natural world that God created. In one of his classic passages, he talked about a meditation on eating an apple or a banana. I cannot really do it justice, but he just talked about color and smell and taste and shape and how God packages things in a certain way. In a more maybe theoretical aspect, you have people like Einstein, who although Einstein did not regrettably believe in the personal God that gave commandments, but Einstein certainly saw in the elegance and the beauty and the fact that billions of phenomena can be reduced to fundamental, relatively few fundamental laws, and he of course was seeking one law to explain everything. He saw an unbelievable intelligence, an unbelievable beauty. So this is really what one thinks about in Tu B'Shvat. It's not simply Jewish Earth Day, although there's a component of that. But it's a day in which we rethink our connection to the natural world by seeing it with a sense of beauty and reverence and awe and holiness for the grandeur of the creation that God created. And this fosters love of Hashem, and this fosters reverence for Hashem. And I'm just bringing it in, besides the fact that Tu B'Shvat is coming up, because the Maharal makes the point, that's why it's so important that Pesach is during the spring, because spring means there's a certain rejuvenation that Hashem is putting in the air. So if I want to experience Yetzias Mitzrayim, I got to do it during the spring. It's not just an arbitrary, it's not just an arbitrary designation. Okay, so based on this idea that Pesach is both the historical encounter with the Jewish that the Jewish people had in Yetzias Mitzrayim, and the steps that I have to take for my personal liberation, I want to talk about one passage of the Haggadah that was relevant really to last week's Parsha, but it bridges over to this week's Parsha as well. There's a famous statement in the Haggadah, which is really from the Mishnah, that Rabban Gamliel offers us. And he says, anyone that does not explain three things for Pesach does not fulfill his obligation of the narrative. And those three things are why we eat the Korban Pesach, when there was a temple, Pesach, why we eat the matzah, and why we eat the maror. And if you don't explain those things at the Seder, you're not yotzei, the mitzvah. Now I know it's a little early for Pesach, I'm mentioning it because we're reading the Parshias, but let me just mention an important halachic observation. That actually means that the statement of Rabbi Gamliel explaining the Pesach, matzah, and maror is the single most important part of the Haggadah, at least of the narrative. If you can only say one part of the Haggadah, that's the part you gotta say. In English or Hebrew, that makes no difference, but you have to say it. Now, what's a little anomalous is that this portion is towards the very end of the Maggid, right before people are going to get up and wash and start eating food. So what often happens is, that's exactly when either the ladies of the house, or men can do it too, it wouldn't hurt, when they go into the kitchen to start preparing food, and that is specifically the part of the Haggadah that they're most likely to miss. So it's extremely important for whoever is going to get up and serve the food that before they get up, or at least or even afterwards, they be sure to read, in English or in Hebrew, that makes no difference, to read that particular section. If you simply skip it, then even if you said everything else, you are not yotzei, the Haggadah. There are other parts of the Haggadah that if you skip, you are yotzei. For example, if you skip the four sons, as interesting as that section is, you're absolutely yotzei. In other words, that is not an essential part of the Haggadah. It's something we say, but if you didn't say it, you would still have the mitzvah. If you didn't say the Rabbi Gamliel paragraph, you would not have that mitzvah. So the three things you got to explain are Pesach, matzah, maror. So what I want to do tonight is simply show how those three steps tie in not only to our communal story, which of course they do, but how it ties into the personal Yetzias Mitzrayim that we have to go through to break through our limitations and break through our slavery. And I'm going to take it in reverse order, and I'll explain why as I go through it, why I'm going in reverse order. Step number one is maror, eating bitter herbs. Eating bitter herbs, although they don't have to be that bitter, romaine lettuce is actually fine because it has a slight bitter taste, so God is very lenient on that, although I know some purists insist on real horseradish. But I do want to warn the purists that they have to be purists, meaning bottled horseradish, even if it's kosher lePesach, is absolutely not kosher for the Seder. Oh. Be sure you understand that, because bottled horseradish is pickled in vinegar, and anything that's pickled is not kosher for the mitzvah of maror. So if you're using horseradish, you can use raw horseradish that is grated, but not the horseradish in a bottle. You can use it during the meal, and you can use it during the rest of Pesach, but you cannot do the mitzvah of maror with bottled horseradish. So be aware of that. But be it as it may, what is the purpose of maror? To remember slavery. What lesson is that for us in our own Yetzias Mitzrayim? That the first step to being able to achieve liberation is to be honest enough to acknowledge to yourself that there's something in which I am enslaved. If you live in a condition of denial, to yourself, we're not talking about having to confess to anybody else. If you simply sweep the problem under the rug, whether it's an anger problem, whether it's a relationship problem, whether it's a selfishness problem, if you simply don't acknowledge it, if you don't acknowledge that there's a slavery here, there's nothing you will ever do to extricate yourself. So paradoxically, acknowledgement of slavery is the first step towards achieving freedom. I remember when I moved to Silver Spring, Maryland, and I was commuting to Baltimore because I was a law professor in Baltimore. So, those of you that know that part of the United States, know that Baltimore is north, obviously, and you take a major highway called 95 North from Silver Spring, from the Washington area to Baltimore, 95 North. Now, there is a turnoff, though, if you're not carefully watching the road, in which you could find yourself on 95 South. If you're in the right lane and you're not thinking. So I remember when I first moved, and I was not totally familiar with the drive yet, so I was driving to Baltimore, 95 North, and I was like daydreaming a little bit. And all of a sudden, I start seeing the Washington Monuments, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Monuments, or Jefferson Memorial. And I had never remembered seeing them on the way to Baltimore before. So for like one sinking second, am I going towards Virginia, which I was actually. But here's the funny thing. I didn't want to admit to myself, I can't explain this rationally, I didn't want to admit I was on 95 South, because if I wasn't quite sure how to correct myself. So I started telling myself idiotic things. I said, maybe you do see the Washington Monument from Baltimore. You never noticed it before. Maybe it was something new. And I was thinking, or maybe if I just keep on going, somehow the road will correct itself. Magical thinking. Now, indeed, that is the case, because 95 South ends in Florida, Key West, and you just have to make a U-turn. So, yeah, I could have kept going, and eventually, I would have corrected myself. But I certainly would have been late for class. It would have taken a few days or so to make that drive. So what was going through my mind, as crazy as it was, I just didn't want to confront the difficulty of acknowledging that there was a problem. Now, obviously, by not confronting it, the difficulty is going to be a lot worse. But at least for a few minutes, it gives me the ability to make believe there's not a problem. In investments, this happens all the time. This is the phrase, throwing good money after bad. You put your money in a rotten investment. It keeps on losing and losing and losing and losing. But you don't want to admit to yourself, I've lost $1,000. So you put in another $1,000 in some crazy hope that it'll get better, even though that means you lose $2,000. Albert Einstein, again, said it best. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get a different result. Although I have a feeling that Einstein might be expressing his disagreement with quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, indeed, such a thing is possible, but Einstein was against the idea of quantum mechanics too, because he said God does not play with dice. Okay, without getting into that issue. But overall, therefore, you got to acknowledge, if you want to change, you want to move, you want to be positive, you don't want to be stuck in the old destructive patterns of life, you got to taste the slavery. Be honest. Admit. Understand that there are things that are wrong here, and things that if I could change, again, to quote or paraphrase the alcoholic's prayer, if I can change them, I'll try to change them. If not, then I have to accept, to be sure. But that which is in the realm of change, right? I can change, right? So Moror, we will call, is the cognitive awareness and honesty of acknowledging to yourself that there's a Mitzrayim in my life. There is a Mitzrayim in my life. Okay, we then come to matzah. I'll come back to this. Now, matzah is actually a complicated symbol. It's an amazing thing. Most of us heard why we eat matzah on Pesach, and we heard it in second grade. At least even if you went to a Hebrew school or whatever it would be. And yet, as you get older, you actually discover that why we eat matzah on Pesach is actually a complicated issue. Because Pesach has both slavery symbols and freedom symbols. Maror, for example, is a slavery symbol. Drinking 4 cups of wine, which is rabbinic, is a freedom symbol. We're celebrating. Matzah is actually a composite symbol. There are 2 separate reasons why we eat matzah, and the reasons are not even connected. Reason number 1 is Matzah is called the bread of affliction, lechem oni, the bread of poverty, the bread of servitude. The Ibn Ezra, who was a world traveler, points out that when he went to India, he noticed the Maharajas were feeding their slaves unleavened bread because, as we know, it stays in the digestive system quite a long time, so you eat less of it. So when the Jews were slaves in Egypt, the Egyptians gave them matzah. That's the meaning of the passage of the Haggadah, Ha lachma anya. This is the bread of affliction that our forefathers ate in Egypt. When did they eat it in Egypt? It's not referring to the Seder. They ate it as slaves. So on that level, matzah is a symbol of slavery, persecution, and poverty. That's why there's actually a halacha that matzah has to be plain flour and water. You cannot eat, for the Seder at least, you cannot eat matzah with fruit juice or egg yolk, what's called egg matzah, because that's called matzah ashira. That's rich matzah. And matzah got to be poor man's bread. Now that's one reason. The other reason is the more familiar reason that's given, and that is when we left Mitzrayim, we wanted to bake our bread, and we would have let it rise to become leavened, but the Egyptians, or HaKadosh Baruch Hu, said, you got to leave this very minute, and we didn't have time to let our dough rise. So the matzah is symbolic of how hurried we were when it was time to be redeemed. So matzah is both a symbol of slavery and a symbol of redemption. It is a composite symbol that embodies both motifs. Lechem oni, bread of affliction, and chipazon, the need to hurry, because we would have hit the 50th. Remember, there's a tradition from the Arizal that in Mitzrayim, we should have been there 400 years, but we were taken out after 210 years because we were on the 49th level of impurity. Had we stayed another minute, we would have hit level 50. That would have been irredeemable. We don't even know what that means exactly, another minute, but therefore we were taken out. And the matzah is a reminder of the speed and the haste by which we were taken out of Mitzrayim. Right? So matzah is complicated. Matzah has a double symbol, and possibly, if you want to develop this further, which I'm not going to fully develop it, maybe there's a difference between the first matzah that you eat and the afikomen. Maybe one is the slavery and one is the freedom. You could split it that way. There are different ways of looking at it. And of course, in the korach sandwich, you actually combine the matzah and the maror. Right? Are you combining slavery and freedom, or are you combining slavery and slavery? Like, what is the meaning of the matzah in the sandwich? Right? There's a lot of elaboration that one could put here. But I want to mention two other ideas. Besides the basic idea that matzah is the bread of affliction and matzah is the bread of redemption, right? Two opposite ideas, we do have the famous idea that chametz, which is puffed up, represents arrogance and ego, and matzah, which is flat, represents humility. And there's a fundamental idea that one develops a relationship to God only when there is nullification of the ego. When there is arrogance, when there is conceit, God cannot connect to that person, or you as a person cannot connect to God. And therefore, matzah is the essential condition for that ability to break through your Mitzrayim by not having that ego. So that's one idea. If the maror is the cognitive honesty of my slavery, matzah is the obliteration of ego. Now, even on a simple level, you can understand why putting your ego to the side is so essential to dealing with problems. Because when one is filled with egotism and arrogance, one is not willing to acknowledge shortcomings. And certainly one is not willing to get the help they need, because you would have to kind of go to somebody, go to a therapist, whatever it would be, a rabbi. And the person of egotism cannot do that. And by the way, this is even a problem among rabbis, so to speak. The rabbi himself may be in need of something, and the rabbi feels they cannot compromise his position. Egotism is really, in fact, Ronald Reagan I don't quote him that often. Ronald Reagan once remarked, "It is amazing what human beings can accomplish when they don't care who gets the credit." He was pointing out that how egotism really stops things from happening. When there's not an ego, you're open to people, you're willing to learn, you're willing to grow, you're willing to acknowledge your weakness. And then every person in that situation becomes a better person because they're not there to protect their turf or maintain their agendas. So matzah is very powerful in the sense of obliteration of ego. But there's a second symbolism of matzah that's also very, very interesting. And this is offered by the Maharal of Prague. Maharal says the difference between chametz and matzah is not only ego versus humility, which is very, very true, but it's also inertia versus decisive action. Chametz represents inertia. Why is that so? Because when flour gets wet, if you do nothing, it will become chametz automatically. You don't need yeast, you don't need a starter. Halachically, if water falls on unbaked flour, once it's baked, it's not a problem. If water falls on unbaked flour, it is deemed to be fermented. After 18 minutes, got to be destroyed. So chametz happens. Matzah, you must take action to make it matzah, to arrest the chametz. So the Maharal says, when I think of chametz, I think of inertia, just letting things happen. Matzah is seize the moment. And here, the relationship with the moror and the matzah is very interesting. It may be similar to the relationship between psychotherapy and behavioral analysis. And that is, moror gives me insight into my condition. But you know, many people may have insight in their conditions. They may have gone to psychotherapy for 50 years. They know every trauma they ever suffered, starting from birth trauma, and maybe conception trauma, maybe preconception traumas. You know, they know the whole story. But okay, you might be filled with insight and understanding. And they may become a fascinating hobby to know exactly what makes me click or tick. But the question becomes, what do you do about it? What practical changes have you made in your life? Right? So therefore, if moror is the cognitive awareness of my Mitzrayim, matzah is the need to take action. And this is an important idea in spiritual growth, because everybody in their life has moments of inspiration. There are moments in which we just feel we want to be more connected to God. Now, these moments can occur in many, many different times. It may be after Yom Kippur, it may be after a Pesach Seder, it may be at the wedding of a grandchild, or the birth of a grandchild, or a wedding of a child, whatever it might be. It may be watching a sunset in Yerushalayim. Everyone has a different trigger, maybe hearing a piece of music. A person just feels they want to be a part of something greater than themselves. They feel connected. But you know, if you don't concretize that feeling in some type of virtuous action, even if it's very small, feelings just disappear. They come and they go. When you concretize them, it can kind of take root in your personality, and then we have the promise of our sages. Mitzvah gaireres mitzvah. One mitzvah makes you stronger for the next mitzvah. You know, there was a famous American academic, Robert Hutchins, who was a kind of a boy wonder. He became president of the University of Chicago, I think at the age of 25. I mean, there were many graduate students who were older than him. He really was a prodigy. And apparently he was not taking good care of his health, so one of his associates once asked him, you know, Dr. Hutchins, don't you ever want to do some exercise? So he says, I surely have the urge to exercise all the time, but I know if I lie down, it'll pass in a few minutes. So I don't let it bother me. I will lie down, and I know in 5 minutes the urge will go away. And that's certainly true for exercise, and it's true in ruchnius, obviously even more so. I mean, let's imagine the scene which has happened to me, and maybe it's happened to you. I don't want to prejudge anybody. Let's say there's someone with whom you've had a disagreement. And it is traditional and it is proper that you try to make up with them, especially around Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, but even the whole year. It's a proper thing to do. But it's hard to make that phone call. It's hard to break that ice. It's hard to reopen a relationship that was difficult and try to make things better. But every once in a while, you really get the urge, I'm going to pick up that phone. Well, if the phone is within 6 inches of your hand, maybe you'll do it. If you have to walk 2 feet, by the time you walk 2 feet, maybe not today. Because the feeling, the inspiration, can be very, very brief, and it leaves, it's evanescent. So, maror is be honest to yourself. Matzah, take action. And it also, the first point is also valid, and that is, get ego out of the equation. When ego is present, you're not going to move forward. It's going to stop you. And in fact, in life generally, if you think about it, fear of failure is a great, great inhibitor in all sorts of things that people fail to do. I don't do something because I'm embarrassed. It's not going to be good and people will laugh at me. I'll give you examples outside of religion. There are surveys that show when adults make a list of things they regret not doing in their life. So they might say, I regret not not starting to play piano when I was in my 50s. I really wanted to do so. But I thought, how good am I going to be if I start in my 50s? Or, I really like to sing, even though my voice isn't so great. But I could have joined some a cappella group that didn't have high standards, But they would, people would laugh at me. So, people say later, when they're already, in their 80s, too old to, even though then they're not necessarily too old, but they might say, gee, if I would have started when I was 50, by the time I was 80, maybe I would play pretty good. And I could have had years of enjoyment. Now, the point I'm making is, this egotism, whether it comes in the form of arrogance, or whether it comes in the opposite, low self-esteem, because that's also kind of an egotistical judgment, is a great, great inhibitor. It freezes you. It stops you from moving forward. The willingness to fail is a major component of humility. Meaning, I do my best. It's up to Hashem whether I'm successful. If I fail when I did my best, I did nothing wrong. I only did something good. And the Ribbono Shel Olam, for whatever reason, it wasn't my time to do this particular project. It's a whole different approach to life, in which you're not looking at life as an experience to confirm how great you are or how bad you are. You look at life as a task-oriented situation where Hashem put me in this world to do good things. And I do my best to do good things. I don't get crushed when I'm defeated, and I don't get a swelled head when I'm successful. I just keep an even keel, an even course, to always ask myself, what's the best thing I can do for God at this particular moment in my life? What's the best thing? Again, if you look at the Tanya, you will see over and over again that apparently this was something Rav Shneur Zalman thought about very, very much, because he emphasizes it over and over again. The notion of bitul. Bitul is nullifying yourself to Hashem's agenda and not necessarily connecting yourself to the ego. And I will tell you, I've met myself many, many Chabad Shaluchim, although there may be stories the other way too, I'm not going to deny that. But I have met many, many Shaluchim. And one of the things I've noticed, I think they have internalized, I guess the last Rebbe emphasized it as well, but it comes from the Tanya. They have internalized this notion of Bitul Hayesh, that they're here to serve Hashem and the Jewish people, and it's not about them. That's an amazingly empowering idea. It's not that you're a nebush and a nothing. It's the other way around. It empowers you to do all sorts of things. because you're not afraid of failing anymore, because failure and success is not up to you. Okay, so that's the idea of matzah. We then come to Pesach. Now, Korban Pesach, of course, has many, many symbols, but I want to pick one out of many. I could have chosen many, many to talk about. I'm going to pick one. And that is, one of the halachos of the Korban Pesach is, it cannot be brought in solitude. I have to be part of a chabura. It's either my family, or I join a group of people, even if we're not biological family. Ein shochtin es ha-Pesach al hayachid. We do not bring a Korban Pesach for an individual. Even if I have a ravenous appetite and I have a tiny lamb, because it only has to be 8 days old, and I could finish the whole thing, I'm not allowed to do it. I got to join with other people. So the lesson in our own Yetziat Mitzrayim is the idea of community. That if you want to leave your Mitzrayim, it cannot be a solitary journey. You need to connect to others. Ideally, that could be a spouse, in which you work together on goals. It can and should be a larger community, like Beit Knesset, the yeshiva, a group, Yiboneh, whatever it would be. We work together because we give each other strength. Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest of all people, tells us in Koheles, Tovim hashnayim min ha'echad. Two are better than one, because if one falls, who will pick him up? And if you have two people and one falls, the other is there. This is not only talking about ice and snow, although that's true as well. It's talking about life. In life, there are times in which we are weaker than we want to be. There are times that we are strong, and there are times that we are weak. But when you have a friend, again, the friend could be a spouse or a friend, whatever, a different context of friendship. I give him strength in his moments of weakness. He gives me strength in my moments of weakness. And that's why Pirkei Avos says, Kinei l'cha chaver. Now literally, kinei can actually mean buy yourself a friend. B-U-Y. Why would you buy yourself a friend? You got to pay for a friend. So some say, well, it means that's a therapist. You buy a friend for 50 minutes, meaning if you're not zoche to have a friend, you got to spend money for a friend. But I would suggest maybe another explanation, and that is, friendship does have a cost. The cost of friendship is being a friend. Meaning, if I want you to be there whenever I have a problem, whenever I have to unburden myself, the cost is I have to be there for you. Because I can't be a person that says, I want you to listen to all my problems, but when you have a problem, sorry, don't have time. So friendship does have a cost. The cost of having a friend is being a friend. That's the reciprocity that is needed. Now, sometimes you might be so lucky to have such an extraordinary person that he's willing to be there for you even though you're not willing to be there for them. But that's relatively unusual, I think. In most cases, friendship has to be reciprocal. But why is it important to have friendship? So the Rambam has an interesting discussion, which, interestingly enough, it is actually taken from Aristotle, with some modifications, unattributed, but it actually is in the Ethics of Aristotle, where Aristotle talks about why is friendship a good thing? Why do human beings need friendship? So he gives 3 reasons. The first reason for friendship we will call utilitarian. It's like having an insurance policy. At various times in my life, I have needs. Maybe I lost my keys. Maybe my refrigerator broke. Maybe I broke a leg and I can't go shopping. If I don't have a friend, who do I call? So in a sense, friendship is like an insurance policy. Meaning even if I'm a misanthrope, I really don't like people. But it's good to cultivate a friend just in case. Right? That's kind of the insurance policy model of friendship, which is purely utilitarian. The second purpose of friendship is social. That, Aristotle famously says, man is a social being. even if a person is introverted, so he may not like crowds, but even a one-to-one, we like to discuss, we like to explore, we like to share things with people. The famous joke about a rabbi, not too religious, who was a fanatical golf addict, and he had to play golf every single day. So it was Yom Kippur. So before Yom Kippur services, he figured no Jew would see him, so he went to the golf course, and he was playing 8 holes early in the morning, Hashtama. So the angels in heaven were furious. They went to God, and they said, strike this man dead. He's a rabbi, he's going to give sermons, he's going to give prayers on Yom Kippur, and look at what he really believes. He plays golf on the holiest day of the year. Such a man deserves to die immediately. And God says, leave it to my superior wisdom. I will determine the appropriate punishment. And the rabbi gets a hole-in-one, and a very difficult hole. A hole-in-one. So the angels of heaven say, this is what you do to the worst sinner on earth. God says, yeah, who is he going to share it with? Who is he going to tell? And that's the greatest Gehenna, when we can't share these experiences of our lives. So that's the second function of friendship, kind of social. And the social can exist on many levels. It can be an emotional, social relationship, an intellectual, social relationship, an exchange of ideas. We enjoy connecting to other people. Extroverts like doing it in crowds in a loud way. Introverts like doing it in a quiet way. But their kesher is still there. But Aristotle and the Rambam say there's a third concept in friendship. Now the Rambam turns it into a spiritual. Aristotle does not use the concept spiritual, but the concept is to help each other become a better person than they otherwise would be. The Rambam would call that a spiritual connection. Now that type of friendship, by the way, can sometimes be difficult. Because when you're simply friendly with somebody on a casual basis, so if they do things that aren't so honest or moral or good, you may just ignore it because you're getting what you need out of the friendship. But when friendship is based on helping each other become the best person they could be, then that sometimes may be a bit challenging. You'll bring up something, and you have to be willing to hear what that person brings up. Marriage, in the best way, is that way, in which each person cares so deeply about the other that if they see the other person going in the wrong derech, they're going to be willing to talk about it. There may be some pain in that friendship, but it's a pain that comes out of love. And that is, the Rambam writes, the Kenei L'cha Chaver, acquiring a friend that will help you be a better person than you otherwise would be. In fact, that is one of the, not the only one, but that is one of the guidelines in a marriage, actually. One of the guidelines in the marriage is, can my partner help me be better? Can I help them be better? That's actually one of the questions that you ask yourself in deciding if someone is your partner for life. So, Pesach teaches me community. So now, just to summarize with one bullet point for each thing, Moror is to honestly acknowledge your slavery. Matzah, factor out the ego, number one, and number two, take action. Don't simply be aware of a problem. Take practical action. Pesach, find a community which shares those values, whether it's the nuclear family or a larger community. Understand, you can't do it alone. When you have to do it alone, you adjust, as in every case in life. If we're put in a situation, we have to make the best of it. But when you're seeking the optimal situation, you seek community, because that will help you through the moments where you're not necessarily going to be fully inspired. So now I just want to end with one final observation, and that is the order in which we eat these foods. Because if moror is awareness of my slavery, and matzah is doing something about it, one might have thought I should eat the maror before the matzah, because how can I fix a problem till I know what the problem is? And yet we eat matzah, then we eat maror, right? So why do I eat matzah and then maror? I should eat a maror, which is identifying my slavery, and then I eat matzah. The answer is this: it is indeed very much the case that before you can address a problem, you have to know what the problem is. But before you focus on your problem, you must internalize your capacity to make it better. Because the problem is this: when I start focusing on my inadequacies, I focus on my failures, there may be a very unfortunate side effect that I become so overwhelmed and so depressed that I literally get paralyzed. I feel I'm not capable of improving. I'm not capable of changing. So before you focus on your slavery, you need to internalize your capacity for freedom. So I eat the matzah to remind me that I can take decisive action in my life. And only when I've absorbed that message can I then face the maror and then eat matzah again to connote the ability to deal with the problem. Meaning before you confront the negatives in yourself, you must internalize the strengths that you have to deal with those negatives. Because if you don't accept those strengths, then the negatives are going to overwhelm you. Okay, and that's the idea of the matzah preceding the maror. Okay, so this again, as I say, the overall lesson here is that the technicalities of the mitzvah of recounting the Exodus are also signposts helping us as we go through our own personalized Yitzias Mitzrayim. As the Baal Tanya explains, Mitzrayim refers to our limitations. So, B'ezrat Hashem, I hope that all of us will be able to follow this in our own lives. Much easier said than done, 100% the case. And in that way, may HaKadosh Baruch Hu grant us the true freedom of the neshama to be able to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in all the beautiful ways that we can.